Okay, my friend, let's talk Wuthering Heights, a recent film adaptation of Wuthering Heights recently came out, and I put adaptation in quotes because that really is not an accurate word for whatever the heck that was. It was more like a disturbing, icky dream slash nightmare that took 136 minutes of my life that I will never get back. And the film is getting a lot of attention. Obviously, I think because of how controversial it is. And it's obvious that it gets Wuthering Heights, the book and the story, so completely wrong. But I think that was the intention of the director. Just from hearing her share her reasonings for adapting it the way that she did. So this video is not a deep dive into how much that film got the book wrong. It's more adjacent. But overall, doing a deep dive ish of the story. But also because we've also gotten this story so completely wrong. Not just the film and not just other film adaptations, which I grew up watching a lot of old films, so I might have seen an older version. I just don't remember. So I might be stating the obvious, but I don't think that I am when I say Wuthering Heights is not a love story. It never was a love story, and Emily Bronte was not writing a romance. I believe she was writing a warning. She gave a very interesting and deeply uncomfortable portrait of obsession, of cruelty, of generational curses, destruction that comes from unchecked grief and rage. So I think the misreading of the story as a whole is really not merely a literary problem. I think it's a cultural problem, and it's an interesting one to talk about. So let's dig into briefly how the relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine actually works or doesn't work. So Heathcliff is brought into the Earnshaw home as a child. He and Catherine grow up together. They're both wild, spirited, stubborn, hard-headed, inseparable, and there's a bond there. They create a friendship. And even from the beginning, though, there's this cruelty and meanness, both of them to each other. Catherine is mean to Heathcliff, and Heathcliff is equally mean to Catherine. I mean, yes, kids can be cruel, but they never seem to mature and move on from it. So Catherine uses Edgar Linton, who is the neighbor who's in love with her and wants to marry her. She uses that attention as a way to make Heathcliff jealous. And as a side note, I'm going to pause for a second. There will be spoilers in this video. So if you have not read the book or watched any film adaptation, you might want to pause and come back to this later. So you have been warned, FYI. So Catherine decides to use the interest from Edgar to make Heathcliff jealous. And then comes a moment that really changes everything. Heathcliff overhears Catherine talking to Nellie, the housekeeper, telling her that it would degrade her to marry him. And I'm going to read directly from the book because she says it a lot better than I can summarize. It's a quick sentence. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now. so he shall never know how I love him. And that not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. Oh, that's so romantic, isn't it? No, it's not. It's codependent. It's enmeshment. It's not healthy. She says she loves him, though. She says their souls are the same. And yet, in that same breath, in that next moment, she decides and says that marrying him would somehow diminish her as a person. It would degrade her. I mean, that's pretty cruel. That is, I'd be shattered if I overheard someone saying that about me. That is obviously not romance. That, like I mentioned, is enmeshment. Not being able to see yourself apart from someone else is enmeshment. It's codependency. And in a way, it's kind of like a backhanded compliment. But I also understand, the practical ramifications here of Catherine seeing Edgar as an opportunity to have a life that she didn't have before, to, offer her security and safety, something that Heathcliff probably would never be able to offer her. So she thinks, even though she doesn't love Edgar, she still marries him. So Heathcliff overhears that part and he leaves. He's gone for 3 years. And when he comes back, somehow with a whole lot of wealth, that it's not explained how he comes into that wealth, but that's really not the point of the story. That's not the point. So he leaves, comes back. Catherine is married with a child on the way with Edgar. And Heathcliff is not okay. He is salty, to put it mildly, and angry. He is very, very angry. And with his wealth, he somehow buys Wuthering Heights for the sole purpose of lording it over Catherine and everyone else that lives there. And he proceeds to make everyone's life a living hell. He then decides to marry Edgar's sister, Isabella. Not because he fell in love with her or he cares about her or thinks that she's beautiful. He marries her purely out of spite to make Catherine jealous and Edgar angry. And he outright tells Isabella to her face that he cares nothing for her. That is cold. And that it's crushing. I mean, imagine having your future husband tell you that I will marry you, but I don't care for you at all. He also proceeds to deny Catherine's nephew, Hareton, who lives at Wuthering Heights, any education, any dignity, any kindness. And so Heathcliff perpetuates that cycle, that it's now starting. This cycle of abuse and cruelty is now continuing. He's doing the same thing to Hareton that was done to him as a child. That is not love at all. And the saddest part, there's a lot of sad parts in this book, is that Catherine dies, and instead of grieving and healing, Heathcliff doubles down on his cruelty. His anchor in Catherine is gone, and he loses his mind. He becomes almost like a shadow of himself. And in a way, it's like he dies with her. And anyone left in his path has to bear the weight of his out of control grief and rage. So I think Emily Bronte is really showing us here the difference between obsession and love. And guys, this is not something to aspire to. When people say this is the greatest love story ever written, it is not. It is absolutely not. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that it's not. This really is a trauma response with no way through the darkness. Heathcliff saw no way out. His only desire was now gone. And so instead of moving on with his life and healing and having a life, he just lets bitterness and anger consume him the way that he and Catherine consumed each other. And here's the part that really no one talks about, which I find so shocking. And I think this is the most important part of the book. There is a love story here. It's just not between Catherine and Heathcliff. The actual love story happens towards the end of the book. And it is everything that Heathcliff and Catherine's relationship wasn't. So after Heathcliff dies, and Emily does not really spell out what he dies of, unless she did and I somehow missed it. I mean, that is possible. But I think he dies from the weight of just a life consumed with bitterness and unforgiveness and rage. And this hatred finally catching up to him. And his death in the book, it acts like a cleansing rain. It's like the darkness has finally lifted in the story. The fog on the moors has cleared, and everyone can breathe again. Actually, maybe everyone can breathe for the first time ever. And into that cleared air enters Hareton and young Kathy. So young Kathy is the child between Catherine and her husband Edgar. And Hareton was raised by Heathcliff at Wuthering Heights when he came back. But he was raised in just utter cruelty and neglect. He was denied an education. He was denied just basic human kindness, any kind of dignity. And so as a result of being raised by Heathcliff, he's rough, he's mean in his own way, he's illiterate, not because he's stupid, but because he was raised by a brute, by someone who just intentionally wanted to make him suffer just because he could. And he never got the chance to. And so here comes young Kathy, who carries a lot of her mother's fire and stubbornness and personality traits and flaws, but she has compassion on Hareton. And so young Kathy teaches Hareton to read. And they both, in a way, have to relearn or learn for the first time how to be human, how to relate to one another in a way that is not built on possession and spite. You know, there's the generational abuse starts to dwindle and it stops. And so by the end of the book, you know, they're planning to marry, because people married their cousins back then. So they're planning to marry, and you can feel the whole story up to this point exhale. The whole book just takes a big deep breath and then lets it out. And you don't realize that up to this point in the book, you've been holding your breath the entire time. And I think that was the contrast that Emily Bronte was creating. And maybe a lot of it was just unintentionally, but maybe intentionally. You know, she doesn't just show us what obsession looks like. She also, you know, towards the end, she shows us an alternative. Love over cruelty, healing over revenge, restoration over destruction, redemption over death. That is what genuine love looks like in this book. And, you know, I wish that there was more of that, like there was more of the book filled with that redemptive element, but it's her book and not mine. But it's there and it's intentional. And so maybe the question is, well, what does this matter? This is a 175-year-old novel, right? I think 175 years. But here's the thing. We live in a culture that has a very bad habit of romanticizing toxicity. The brooding, intense guy who only acts the way that he does because he just loves you so much and that's just how he is. You know, we see that over and over again in movies and TV and, you know, commercial books. And so I think with that priming, perhaps like because of that, we've been misinterpreting Wuthering Heights for a long, long time. And maybe Hollywood is to blame for a lot of that. You know, the new film especially is a perfect example. You know, instead of showing and having, you know, a great opportunity to show what obsession and abuse actually looks like, it glamorizes it instead. And it makes Heathcliff and Catherine into characters that they are not. And yes, the movie has beautiful sets and, you know, gorgeous cinematography and beautiful, if not historically inaccurate costumes, but none of the darkness, none of the ugliness that actually defines Heathcliff and Catherine as characters in the real story. You know, the film really softens Heathcliff into this brooding, romantic, misunderstood character when the whole point of him is that he's not any of that. He's definitely not romantic. So when we look at Catherine and Heathcliff and what they have, and we, you know, swoon and call it passion, we're not teaching ourselves, you know, we are teaching ourselves something that's actually quite dangerous, I think, and convincing ourselves that this is what love looks like. And also, for the record, guys, these two are teenagers. They are late teens who have not even merged into adulthood. So I think the critical thinking lesson here, something that I've been mulling over for a while, is that we have to pay attention to what Emily Bronte was actually trying to communicate through her own worldview and time period, and not the modern worldview that permeates our current culture right now, that also attempts to interpret her story as a commercial romance. The story is so much deeper and richer than that. And like I mentioned, and I will say it again, Emily Bronte was not writing a romance. She was writing a cultural critique, a warning, if you will, about what happens when you let prejudice and pride, pride and prejudice, anger, bitterness, you know, unforgiveness perpetuate and continue from generation to generation, while also leaving behind, you know, this veneer, if you will, of religion instead of real transformation in Christ. It never works out, you know, for anybody. And it destroys everyone that it touches. And it doesn't, you know, this cycle does not stop until someone makes a choice to. And there's one last thing that I found really interesting, is the way that she weaves in a lot of religious themes through the story, particularly through the character of Joseph, who's the handyman at Wuthering Heights, who the film completely, I mean, just butchered that character. But Joseph was portrayed as deeply religious and deeply cruel at the same time. You know, he just would quote scripture right before he would say something so abusive and cruel and mean. And, you know, that contrast was just very disturbing. Because Bronte, you know, herself, she grew up, you know, in a household where her father was a clergyman. And so she was able to see and witness and experience people who genuinely believed and had faith, and those who performed belief. So Joseph, as the character, had the form but no substance. There was no truth to his faith. There was nothing real about it for him. Because when it's real, it transforms your life. And he was one of the most cruel characters in this story. And I think that's part of the warning too. You know, it's not just enough to say the right things. It matters what you actually do. Like, faith without works is dead and meaningless. And I think once you see the difference between obsession and love in this book, you'll start to see it everywhere. And I think that's one of the real takeaways. I think there's so many takeaways of this book. I have equally hated it and loved it at the same time. Hated it because the story is just so tragic, and I'm so mad at Heathcliff and Catherine for how they treat each other. You know, I annotated a lot of this book, you know, underlining and writing notes in the margin, and I just so many notes of like, Heathcliff is horrible. I really do not like him. And same thing with Catherine. I don't like any of these characters until we get to the end of the book. Heathcliff and Catherine have been portrayed as having something that we should want instead of the reality, which is being able to learn and recognize the cycles of abuse and doing what it takes to stop it. So that is my take on Wuthering Heights. That is my opinion. It is not exhaustive in any way. I could keep going, but I won't. But I would love to know, have you read Wuthering Heights? What did you think of it? Have you seen any of the film adaptations? What did you think of those? Drop it in the comments below. Give this a like, subscribe, all of those things. And I will see you in the next video. Bye, friend.